Zala was a young girl full of life and curiosity, but fate had not been kind to her. Ever since she was a child, the villagers whispered behind her back, calling her a curse. Some believed she had been born under an ill-fated star, while others thought she brought misfortune wherever she went. No matter what she did, she could never escape the wary glances and hushed conversations that followed her. Her stepmother, a cold and cruel woman, fueled the rumors. She spread lies, telling the villagers that Zala was the reason for the recent drought, the poor harvests, and the mysterious sickness that had swept through their people. Day by day, her place in the village became more uncertain. She had no allies, no one who would stand up for her. One night, her stepmother devised a plan to rid herself of Zala forever. Under the pretense of taking her on a journey to seek blessings from the spirits of the land, she led Zala deep into the heart of the forest. Zala, desperate for her approval, followed without hesitation. As the trees grew denser and the familiar paths disappeared, unease settled in Zala's heart. When she turned to ask where they were going, her stepmother's face was cold, devoid of emotion. Without a word, she shoved Zala backward, sending her tumbling onto the damp forest floor. By the time Zala scrambled to her feet, her stepmother had already vanished into the darkness. The realization struck her like a blow. She had been abandoned. She ran after her, screaming her name, but there was no response. The only answer was the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Tears welled in Zala's eyes as panic set in. The forest around her was nothing like the world she had known. The towering trees stretched endlessly into the sky, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something unfamiliar, something ancient. She tried to take a step forward, but the ground beneath her was uneven, roots twisting like serpents beneath her feet. The night was growing colder, the wind whispering through the leaves, carrying sounds that made her shudder. Every creak of a branch, every distant growl sent a wave of fear through her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to control her breathing. The thought of being alone in the forest, with no food, no shelter, and no idea which way led back to the village, was suffocating. But deep inside, a small part of her whispered that even if she found her way back, would they even let her return? As the last traces of daylight faded, the darkness became absolute. The silence of the forest was unnatural, almost as if it were listening, watching. Somewhere in the distance, a deep growl echoed through the trees. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned in every direction, but she could see nothing. She was not alone. Zala wandered through the thick forest, her bare feet pressing into the damp earth. Every step was slow, uncertain. The trees loomed over her like silent giants, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shivering, not just from the cold, but from the deep unease settling in her bones. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since she had last eaten. She scanned the ground for anything edible, fallen fruit, nuts, even roots she could chew on, but the forest floor was covered in thick layers of leaves and moss. The deeper she walked, the more unnatural the silence became. There were no sounds of birds chirping, no rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching her. She stopped suddenly, heart pounding. Something was watching her. She could feel it. A prickling sensation crawled up her spine. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. At first, she saw nothing but shadows, but then, a flicker. A pair of glowing eyes peered at her from between the trees. Zala's breath caught in her throat. The eyes were too high off the ground to belong to a small animal. She took a cautious step back, but as she did, the eyes vanished. Had she imagined them? She didn't know what was worse, the thought that something was truly there, or the possibility that her mind was already playing tricks on her. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crushing leaves and twigs underfoot. Her pulse raced. It wasn't her imagination. Something was moving through the forest, and it was getting closer. She spun around, trying to see through the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting shifting shadows. Was it an animal? A person? She clenched her fists, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her first instinct was to run, but where? The forest stretched in every direction, endless and unfamiliar. Running blindly could lead her straight into danger. Instead, she crouched behind the base of a large tree, pressing her back against the rough bark. She forced herself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped. Zala swallowed hard, listening. Silence. Then, in the distance, a low, deep growl rumbled through the trees. It wasn't close, but it was unmistakable. A predator. Her body tensed. She had grown up hearing stories of wild beasts lurking in the depths of the forest. Massive creatures with gleaming fangs and unblinking eyes. But no story had ever captured the sheer terror she felt now. The growl came again, this time closer. A lump formed in her throat as she clutched at the rough bark of the tree. She was exhausted, hungry, and freezing. Fear clouded her mind. If she stayed here, she would starve. If she moved, she could walk straight into the jaws of something far worse. She closed her eyes, tears burning behind her eyelids. She was on the verge of giving up, letting the darkness swallow her whole. Then, from the shadows, the golden glow of two piercing eyes emerged. Zala's breath hitched as the golden eyes moved closer, emerging from the depths of the shadows. A massive black panther stepped forward, its sleek coat blending seamlessly with the darkness. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur as it moved with an effortless grace, its eyes fixed solely on her. She couldn't breathe. The stories she had heard as a child echoed in her mind. Tales of great beasts that roamed the forbidden parts of the forest, hunting those who wandered too far. Was this how her story would end? Forgotten in the heart of the wilderness, claimed by the jaws of a predator. The panther took another step forward. Zala stumbled backward, pressing herself against the tree, her pulse hammering in her ears. She clenched her fists, knowing there was no escape. The beast was too fast, too powerful. Running would be useless. The panther stopped a few feet away, lowering its head slightly, its golden eyes never leaving hers. Its presence was overwhelming, its body larger than she had imagined a panther could be. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something she couldn't name. Then, to her astonishment, the panther did not lunge. It did not snarl, nor did it bare its fangs. Instead, it circled her, moving slowly, deliberately, as if studying her. Zala stood frozen, her body trembling. Was it deciding if she was worth the effort of a hunt? Was it toying with her before it struck? She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable. But the attack never came. Instead, she felt a soft, warm pressure against her leg. Her eyes flew open, and she gasped. The panther had nudged her. She blinked in shock, watching as the great beast took a step back, then nudged her again, more insistently this time. It wasn't attacking. It was urging her forward. Zala's mind spun. What did it want? Why wasn't it killing her? The panther let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a threat, but something almost reassuring. Then it turned away from her, walking a few steps into the darkness before stopping to glance back. It was waiting. Zala's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the powerful creature. But something deeper, something unexplainable, held her in place. She felt it, an unspoken connection, a pull. Taking a shaky breath, she took one hesitant step forward. The panther watched her, then continued moving, leading her deeper into the forest. She hesitated for only a moment before following. She didn't know where the beast was taking her. She didn't know if she was walking towards salvation or destruction, But for the first time since being abandoned, she wasn't alone. Zala followed the panther through the dense forest, her footsteps hesitant yet steady. The great beast moved with an effortless grace, slipping between the tangled roots and towering trees as if it had walked this path 1,000 times before. She had no idea where it was leading her, but something deep within told her she was meant to follow. As they ventured deeper, the forest began to change. At first, it was subtle. The air grew warmer, the scent of damp earth mixed with something sweet, something ancient. Then, the changes became undeniable. The trees, once gnarled and twisted, seemed to straighten, their bark smooth and pulsing faintly with a soft golden glow. Vines draped from the branches like curtains, shifting as if alive, parting before the panther as it led the way. Zala's breath caught as she noticed something strange. The plants were glowing. Flowers bloomed in soft, iridescent hues, their petals shimmering under an unseen light. Some of them opened as she passed, as if sensing her presence. Tiny motes of blue and green light floated in the air, dancing like fireflies, swirling around her before drifting away into the trees. Her fingers brushed against a nearby rock and she gasped. Etched into the stone were symbols, intricate markings she couldn't read, yet somehow they felt familiar. The panther paused, turning its golden eyes toward her, then to the markings, as if urging her to look closer. She traced the carvings with trembling fingers. The moment her skin met the stone, a faint warmth spread through her fingertips. The symbols glowed brighter, and for the briefest moment, she swore she heard something. Whispers carried by the wind, voices speaking in a language she did not know but somehow understood. Zala stepped back, her pulse racing. What was this place? The panther let out a low rumble and continued forward. As she walked, the forest seemed to react to her presence. The trees swayed despite the still air, their leaves rustling in hushed voices. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as though alive. The deeper she went, the stronger the pull inside her became, an energy she had never felt before, like something within her was awakening. She wasn't alone. From the corners of her vision, she caught glimpses of shadows moving, flickering just beyond the trees. She turned quickly, but nothing was there. Her skin prickled as unseen eyes followed her every step. Something was watching. A growl rumbled from the panther, deep and threatening. The shadows shrank away. Whatever lurked in the darkness dared not challenge the beast at her side. Zala swallowed hard. This forest was more than just trees and roots. It was alive, ancient, and filled with secrets she could barely comprehend. She should have been afraid. But instead, for the first time in her life, she felt something else. Power. Zala followed the panther through the glowing forest, her heart pounding with anticipation. Every step she took felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't explain. The deeper they ventured, the more the air itself seemed to hum, alive with energy. Then, without warning, the path ended. Before her, the dense trees began to shift, not from the wind, but as if moved by an unseen force. Massive trunks bent aside, vines slithered away, and the thick undergrowth parted, revealing a breathtaking sight beyond. A hidden kingdom lay before her, bathed in a golden glow. Towering stone structures, covered in ancient carvings, rose from the earth, their peaks crowned with lush greenery. Bridges of woven vines connected treetop dwellings, while shimmering waterfalls cascaded down moss-covered cliffs. The sky above was an ethereal shade of blue, dotted with floating orbs of light that hovered like guardian spirits. Zala's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary village. It was ancient, untouched by time, a place of power. The moment she stepped forward, a sudden murmur rippled through the land. Figures emerged from their homes, men, women, and children, all dressed in flowing garments woven with intricate patterns. Their skin glowed faintly under the golden light, and their eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto her. The whispers started immediately. Gasps, shock, awe. But their gazes weren't fixed on her alone. They were staring at the panther by her side. A group of elders, their robes adorned with beads and feathers, stepped forward. Their expressions were unreadable, but their eyes held something deeper: recognition. Then, to Zala's astonishment, they bowed before her, their foreheads touching the earth. One of them, an elderly woman with silver streaks in her braided hair, raised her head, her voice trembling with reverence. The prophecy, it has come true. Zala's pulse quickened. Prophecy? What prophecy? Before she could ask, the elders gently ushered her forward, guiding her toward the heart of the kingdom. The panther walked beside her, silent and watchful, as if it had always belonged here. They led her up the stone steps of a massive temple, its entrance framed by towering pillars carved with the same strange symbols she had seen in the forest. Inside, golden torches flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an intricately carved throne, was the kingdom's leader. A regal figure, draped in deep blue and gold, studied her with piercing eyes. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet filled with certainty. You were never meant to die in the forest, child. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. You were meant to return. Zala's breath hitched. Return. Her mind raced, her heart pounding with questions. Who was she, really? And why had fate led her back to a place she had never known, but somehow felt so familiar? Zala stood frozen as the leader's words echoed in her mind. You were meant to return. The temple walls seemed to close in around her, heavy with the weight of something far greater than she could comprehend. One of the elders stepped forward, gesturing toward the walls. Come, she said gently. See for yourself. Zala hesitated, then followed. Her fingers traced the carvings, etched deep into the stone. Figures locked in battle, a great kingdom hidden behind towering trees, a black panther with piercing golden eyes. And then her breath caught in her throat. There, carved into the ancient stone, was her own face. Her heart pounded. It was impossible. The girl in the carving had the same sharp features, the same intense gaze, but this was ancient, far older than she was. What did it mean? The elder turned to her, eyes glistening. You are the lost princess, she whispered, the child of prophecy, the one destined to save us. Zala shook her head, stepping back. No. This can't be right. She had spent her whole life as an outsider, unwanted and cast aside. She wasn't a princess. She was a girl who had barely survived. How could she be the key to saving a hidden kingdom? The elder continued, her voice unwavering. Long ago, a child was born under a sacred star. She was meant to lead our people, but darkness fell upon the land. Enemies sought to destroy her before she could fulfill her destiny. To protect her, she was taken away, hidden among those who would never know her true worth. Zala's stomach twisted. They were talking about her. Her mind raced with memories, her stepmother's cruelty, the village's whispers, the feeling that she never truly belonged. Could this be why? Had she been taken from this place as a child, only to be abandoned in the world beyond? Then she felt it. A warmth spreading through her chest, curling through her veins like fire and starlight. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was something ancient, something that had been inside her all along, waiting to be awakened. She turned to the panther, who sat silently by her side, watching. Understanding settled in her heart like a missing puzzle piece. This creature had not found her by chance. It had been waiting, the guardian of the lost princess. The panther bowed its head slightly, as if acknowledging the truth she was only beginning to grasp. Zala swallowed hard. Could it be real? Was she truly meant to be here? A deep rumbling filled the temple, a force neither seen nor fully understood. The torches flickered, and for the first time, Zala saw her own reflection in the golden flames, not as the girl abandoned in the forest, but as someone more, someone powerful. And in that moment, she knew. Her destiny had only just begun. Zala stood at the foot of an ancient stone archway, the Panther beside her. The elders had spoken. Before she could claim her place, she had to prove herself worthy. The trials were set long ago, meant for the one destined to lead. If she failed, she would never unlock the power hidden within her. The first trial began the moment she stepped beyond the archway. The air grew thick, swirling with shadows that coiled and stretched, forming a towering wall of polished black stone. A mirror, but not just any mirror. It pulsed with an eerie glow, waiting for her to gaze into its depths. She took a shaky breath and looked. The reflection was not what she expected. It wasn't just her face staring back. It was every painful moment she had ever endured. She saw herself as a child, hungry and shivering under the cruel eyes of those who despised her. She saw the night she was abandoned, her cries for help swallowed by the darkness. And then, she saw what she feared most, a vision of herself walking away, turning her back on the kingdom, leaving it to crumble. Her hands clenched into fists. The whispers of doubt tried to root her in place, but she refused to let them. The past could not control her, and fear would not define her. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. The mirror shattered into dust, its grip over her mind breaking. She had passed the trial of fear. The second trial awaited her in a vast underground chamber where golden light flickered over an ancient pedestal. Upon it lay a stone tablet covered in symbols. The riddle had been passed down for generations, unsolved by any but the rightful heir. The heart of the kingdom is hidden in sight, not in gold, nor in might. Seek what was lost, return what was free. The key lies where roots meet the sea. Zala frowned, repeating the words under her breath. Gold and might weren't the answers. The key was something else, something tied to the land itself. Her mind raced, and then it struck her. The roots, the forest, the sea, the waterfalls that fed the land. She turned sharply, scanning the chamber until her eyes landed on a small basin where water flowed endlessly from the stone. Without hesitation, she reached in, letting her fingers close around a smooth engraved key. The moment she pulled it free, the chamber lit up. She had passed the trial of wisdom. The final test was the hardest. High above the cliffs, a firebird screeched, its feathers blazing with golden flames. It was a creature of pure energy, untamed and wild. No one had ever controlled it, but Zala knew she had to. The panther stepped forward, nudging her gently. She understood. She didn't need to fight the firebird. She needed to connect with it. Closing her eyes, she reached out, feeling the pulse of the kingdom in her veins. When she opened them, the firebird was hovering before her, its wings folded. It let out a piercing cry before bowing its head. She had passed. The elders gathered, their voices rising in song. She was no longer just an outsider. She was the heir. The golden glow of the hidden kingdom began to fade as an unsettling darkness crept along its edges. Word of Zala's return had spread beyond the sacred forest, reaching ears that wished her harm. Far beyond the kingdom's borders, in a fortress carved from jagged black stone, a figure sat upon a cold, towering throne. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and something far more sinister, magic, old and vengeful. A sorcerer, cloaked in robes of deep crimson, listened in silence as his spies delivered the news. She has returned. The room trembled at his rising anger. His fingers curled over the armrest of his throne, his nails sharp as claws. For years, he had ensured the lost princess would never come back. He had sent whispers of poison into the ears of the villagers, twisting their hearts against her. He had made sure she was cast away, left to die, and yet she lived. The sorcerer stood, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the room. If she has come back to reclaim the throne, she will find nothing left of it. He raised his hand, and a black mist swirled into existence. It slithered and coiled, forming into the shape of monstrous warriors with hollow eyes. The darkness spread outward, racing toward the hidden kingdom like a storm on the horizon. The land began to feel it. Zala stood on the temple's highest balcony, looking out over the kingdom. The warmth that once filled the air had grown cold, the trees whispering warnings in a language only the wind could understand. She turned to the elders. Their faces were grim. They know I am here. The eldest among them nodded, and they will come. For a moment, fear threatened to claw its way into Zala's chest. She had barely come to understand who she was, and now she was expected to defend an entire kingdom. But then, a deep, resonant growl shook the air beside her. The panther. It stood tall, golden eyes gleaming, muscles tense, not in fear, but in readiness. Zala exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had not been abandoned in the forest to die. She had been led back to fight, to reclaim what was hers. She turned back to the elders, her voice unwavering. Then we prepare. The panther let out a mighty roar, and across the kingdom, warriors lifted their weapons. The people, once hidden, rose. The battle for the kingdom had begun. The sky darkened as storm clouds churned above the hidden kingdom. A thick fog rolled in, carrying the stench of decay and sorcery. From the edges of the enchanted forest, a monstrous army emerged. Twisted creatures of shadow and steel, their hollow eyes gleaming with cruel intent. At the heart of the battlefield, Zala sat astride the sacred panther, its golden eyes burning like embers. Around her, warriors stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. The elders had blessed them with charms of protection, and the air hummed with ancient power. The enemy's forces stretched as far as the eye could see, led by the dark sorcerer himself. He stood atop a blackened steed, his crimson robes billowing, dark magic coiling around his fingers like living smoke. He sneered at Zala from across the battlefield. "You are a child playing at war," he mocked, his voice slithering through the air. "You were never meant to rule." Zala's grip tightened on the hilt of her blade. And yet, here I stand. The battle began with a roar. Arrows of glowing light clashed against dark magic. Warriors and enchanted beasts charged, their battle cries shaking the earth. The hidden kingdom's guardians, a stampede of horned stags, armored birds of flame, and warriors clad in golden armor, met the enemy head-on. The ground trembled beneath the clash of forces, spells colliding in bursts of fire and ice. Zala fought with the skill of someone who had trained for this moment her entire life. The panther leapt through the battlefield, striking down enemies with razor-sharp claws, its movements as fluid as the wind. Zala's blade flashed, cutting through darkness, her power growing with every strike. Then she saw him, the sorcerer, standing at the battlefield's edge, watching, waiting. She knew this fight would not end until she faced him. With a silent command, the panther bounded forward, weaving through the chaos. The sorcerer turned just as she leaped from the panther's back, blade raised. Their weapons clashed, his staff of dark energy against her glowing steel. The final battle had begun. The sorcerer lashed out with shadows, but Zala countered, her instincts guiding her movements. They fought atop the battlefield ruins, locked in a deadly dance of magic and steel. But the sorcerer was powerful, too powerful. With a wave of his hand, he sent her flying backward, pain exploding through her body as she hit the ground. He loomed over her, magic swirling, ready to strike the final blow. "This kingdom will die with you." But then, the forest answered. A deep, ancient energy surged through Zala, flowing from the land itself. The trees trembled, their roots bursting from the ground. The wind howled, carrying whispers of power. The spirit of the forest had awakened. Zala rose, eyes glowing like twin stars. She lifted her hands, and the earth responded. Vines lashed out, golden light erupted, and the sorcerer's magic crumbled beneath the force of the land itself. With one final strike, she unleashed the full power of her birthright, a surge of energy that shattered the darkness, sending the sorcerer screaming into the void. The battlefield fell silent. The enemy forces, leaderless and broken, fled into the shadows. The land, once darkened by war, began to heal. Zala stood amidst the fallen, victorious. The Panther let out a triumphant roar, echoed by the warriors who had fought beside her. She had done it. The kingdom was safe, the land restored, and she, at last, was home. The golden sun bathed the hidden kingdom in a warm glow as the land healed from the scars of war. The people, once afraid and hidden from the world, now stood together in joyous celebration. The battle was over, their kingdom was safe, and the one destined to rule had finally come home. At the heart of the kingdom, the grand temple stood taller than ever, its walls no longer marked by time and conflict, but glowing with renewed life. It was here, in the sacred halls where ancient kings and queens had once been crowned, that Zala now stood. She was no longer the frightened girl abandoned in the forest. She was no longer the outcast searching for her place. She was Zala, queen of the hidden land. The elders gathered around her, their robes shimmering in the light. The people filled the temple, their eyes shining with hope and pride. At her feet, the sacred Panther rested, watching silently, as if it had known all along that this moment would come. An elder stepped forward, holding a crown forged from gold and woven with vines and gemstones, a crown shaped by the land itself. "You were lost to us once," the elder said, voice thick with emotion, "but fate has returned you home." Zala knelt, her heart pounding. The elder placed the crown gently upon her head, and as it settled, the air in the temple shifted, as if the kingdom itself was exhaling in relief. She had been chosen. The moment the crown touched her head, the people erupted into cheers. Drums echoed through the temple, voices rose in song, and a sense of unity spread across the kingdom. Zala stood, turning to face her people. She was not just their queen, she was one of them. Her gaze traveled to the entrance of the temple, where figures lingered in the shadows, the ones who had abandoned her. The villagers who had cast her out. The people who had feared her, and even her stepmother stood there, their eyes filled with shame and regret. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The past threatened to rise again, but Zala only smiled. She lifted a hand and gestured for them to step forward. She would not hold on to hatred. She would not rule with vengeance. She would be better. And in that moment, she saw their faces change, from fear to relief, from regret to gratitude. With her kingdom reunited, Zala made her first decree. The gates of the hidden land, closed for centuries, would open. No longer would they live in secrecy. No longer would they hide from the world beyond. They would share their wisdom, their magic, their strength. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Zala stood at the highest tower, the sacred Panther by her side. The wind carried whispers of the past, but she looked toward the future. A new era had begun, and she was ready to lead.